It was a quiet afternoon in the heart of downtown. The streets were bustling, as they always were, people going about their daily routines, unaware that something out of the ordinary was about to unfold. The air was warm, and the sun hung lazily in the sky, casting a golden glow over the busy sidewalks. Cars humped, people chatted on their phones, and life moved at its usual pace. But for one man, everything was about to change. James Carter had always been a man who kept to himself. Tall, well-dressed, and with a calm demeanor, he blended in easily with the crowd. Today, like any other day, he was on his way to meet a friend for lunch. His life wasn't extraordinary, just another person living in the city, trying to make his way. But James wasn't just anyone. Beneath his calm exterior lay a truth that very few people knew. As he crossed the street, a police cruiser slowly rolled by. The officers inside, two men, one in his 30s and the other fresh out of the academy, were scanning the area. It wasn't anything out of the ordinary. They were just doing their jobs, keeping an eye out for anything suspicious. But something about James caught their attention. Maybe it was the way he carried himself, or perhaps it was the fact that he looked like he didn't quite belong in this part of town. Whatever it was, the officers exchanged a quick glance, and without a word, they decided to stop him. The cruiser pulled up next to James, and one of the officers called out to him, "Hey you, stop for a second." James turned, his brow furrowing in confusion. He hadn't done anything wrong. Why were they stopping him? James hesitated for a moment, unsure if they were really talking to him. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, his voice steady but cautious. The older officer stepped out of the car, adjusting his belt as he approached. "We just need to ask you a few questions," he said, his tone not quite aggressive, but not exactly friendly either. James could feel the eyes of the pedestrians on him. A few people slowed down to see what was happening, but most kept walking, minding their own business. James glanced around, feeling a sense of unease growing in his chest. He knew he had nothing to hide, but the situation was starting to feel off. "What's this about?" James asked, keeping his hands visible and his tone polite. He had learned long ago that staying calm in these situations was the best way to avoid trouble. "We got a report of someone matching your description involved in some suspicious activity," the officer said, his eyes narrowing as if he was looking for any sign of guilt. James felt a chill run down his spine. "I don't know what you're talking about," he replied, standing his ground. "I'm just on my way to meet a friend." But the officer didn't seem to care. He glanced at his partner, who was now standing by the cruiser, watching the situation unfold. "Mind if we check your ID?" the older officer asked, his voice now carrying a hint of impatience. James knew his rights, and he knew that he hadn't done anything wrong. But he also knew that refusing would only escalate things. With a sigh, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet, handing over his driver's license. The officer took it, glancing down at the name before looking back up at James with a raised eyebrow. "James Carter, huh?" the officer muttered, almost as if the name meant something to him. But after a moment, he handed the ID back, still not satisfied. "You mind if we search you?" James' heart started to race. This was starting to feel less like a routine stop and more like something personal. He looked at the officer, his calm demeanor beginning to crack. "I haven't done anything wrong," he said, his voice firm. "Why are you treating me like a criminal?" The officer's face hardened, and before James could react, he was being grabbed by the arm and shoved against the cruiser. "Hands behind your back," the officer ordered, his voice sharp now. The younger officer moved in quickly, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. James struggled for a moment, confused and angry. "What are you doing?" "I didn't do anything," he shouted, trying to break free from their grip. "Stop resisting," the older officer barked, and within seconds, James found himself in handcuffs, his heart pounding in his chest. A small crowd had gathered now, watching in silence as James was pushed into the back of the police cruiser. He could see the confused faces of the onlookers, some of them shaking their heads, others pulling out their phones to record what was happening. Inside the cruiser, James sat in stunned silence. He had been arrested without cause, and he didn't understand why. His mind raced with questions. Was this about his race? Was it a case of mistaken identity? Or was there something else going on, something much bigger than he could have imagined? As the cruiser sped off, James couldn't shake the feeling that this was no ordinary arrest. There was something strange about the way the officers had looked at him, almost as if they knew more than they were letting on. And he was right. Because what the police didn't realize was that James Carter wasn't just another man on the street. He had a past, one that, if revealed, would change everything. The cruiser pulled into the police station, and as the officers escorted James inside, the commanding officer was waiting. The moment the officer saw James, his eyes widened, and he went pale. "Get those cuffs off him," the commanding officer barked, rushing over. The two officers hesitated, confused by their superior's reaction. "But sir, we—" "Now," the commanding officer shouted, cutting them off. They quickly uncuffed James, who rubbed his wrists, still in shock at what was happening. The commanding officer looked at him with a mixture of fear and respect. "Mr. Carter, we had no idea. If we had known who you really were, this never would have happened." James looked at him, his expression unreadable. "Who I really am?" he echoed, his voice low. The room fell silent, the tension thick in the air. The officers who had arrested him stood frozen, their faces turning pale as they realized the gravity of their mistake, but James wasn't about to make things easy for them. He leaned forward, his eyes locking with the commanding officer's. "You should have done your homework," he said quietly. The commanding officer swallowed hard, but before he could respond, the door to the station burst open and several men in dark suits entered the room. They moved with purpose, their expressions grim. One of them approached James and nodded respectfully. "Mr. Carter," the man in the suit said, his voice calm but authoritative. "We've been looking for you." The room seemed to hold its breath as the weight of the situation sank in. James stood up, his calm demeanor returning. He knew that the truth about his identity would leave everyone in the room speechless. And it was only just the beginning. The room was heavy with silence as James stood there, his mind racing, trying to process what had just happened. He stared at the men in suits who had entered, their serious expressions telling him that whatever was coming next wasn't going to be simple. Everyone around him, the officers who had wrongly arrested him, the commanding officer who had nearly panicked upon seeing him, looked on in stunned confusion. The man in the suit who had addressed James stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "We apologize for the misunderstanding, Mr. Carter. We need to speak with you in private. It's urgent." James didn't move. His eyes flickered to the officers, still reeling from what had just unfolded, then back to the man in the suit. "And who exactly are you?" James asked, his voice measured. He was trying to keep his cool, but he couldn't deny the frustration bubbling beneath the surface. He had been arrested, handcuffed, humiliated in front of a crowd, all without cause. And now this? The man didn't flinch. "I'm with a special division of the government. We've been tracking you for some time, Mr. Carter, but I'm afraid I can't say more here. Please, if you would come with us." James' brow furrowed. Special division. Tracking him? It made no sense. As far as he knew, he was just a regular guy. Sure, his past was complicated, but nothing about his life warranted this kind of attention. And yet, the way this man spoke, the authority in his tone, told James that there was more going on than he understood. He glanced around the room, noticing the tense expressions on everyone's faces. He didn't like being in the dark, but right now, it seemed like the only way to get answers was to play along. "Fine," James said, his voice steady, "but I want to know what this is about." The man in the suit nodded, seemingly relieved that James wasn't resisting. He turned to the officers, his expression hardening. "We'll take it from here. This is out of your jurisdiction." The commanding officer nodded stiffly, still pale from the shock of what had transpired. The officers who had arrested James were stone-faced, but their discomfort was clear. They were used to being in control, and now the tables had turned. James followed the men in suits out of the station, his heart pounding in his chest. He was no stranger to trouble, but this was different. As they led him to a sleek, black car parked outside, he couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was about to happen was going to change everything. The car ride was quiet, the tension thick in the air. James sat in the back seat, glancing out the window as the city blurred by. His mind was racing, trying to piece together the puzzle. Who were these men? And why had they been watching him? He had lived his life carefully, staying out of trouble, avoiding the kind of attention that could lead to moments like this. Yet, here he was. After what felt like an eternity, the car pulled up to a discreet building on the outskirts of the city. It looked unremarkable, just another government facility tucked away from the public eye. The men in suits led James inside, past security checkpoints and down long, sterile hallways. Finally, they entered a room. It was bare except for a table and a few chairs, the kind of room where serious conversations took place. The man in the suit gestured for James to sit, and after a moment's hesitation, he did. The man sat across from him, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Carter, I understand you're confused, and you have every right to be. But before I explain, I need you to understand something. What we're about to discuss is highly sensitive. It's not just about you. It's about something much larger." James leaned forward slightly, his patience wearing thin. "I've been arrested without cause, dragged down here, and now you're talking in riddles. Just tell me what's going on." The man nodded, as if expecting this response. "You're right. You deserve answers." He paused for a moment, as if deciding how much to reveal. "James, the truth is, your identity isn't as simple as you think. You've been living under the radar, but there are people, powerful people, who know exactly who you are, and they've been keeping tabs on you for a long time." James felt a chill run down his spine. "What are you talking about? I'm just an ordinary guy." The man in the suit looked at him, his eyes intense. "No, James. You're far from ordinary. Your family, your lineage, it's connected to something much bigger. Something that goes beyond what most people know." James stared at the man, his mind struggling to keep up. "What does my family have to do with any of this?" The man took a deep breath. "Your family name, Carter, might not mean much to the average person, but to certain groups, it's a name that carries weight. Your ancestors were involved in things that most people don't even know exist. Secret projects, classified operations, things that were meant to stay hidden." James sat back in his chair, the weight of the man's words sinking in. "Secret projects? What are you talking about?" The man leaned in closer, his voice lowering. "Your great-grandfather was part of a highly classified government operation, something that, if revealed, could change the world as we know it. And you, James, are the last link to that legacy." James blinked, stunned into silence. He had never known much about his family's history, but this was something out of a spy novel. "And what does that have to do with me?" The man in the suit glanced around the room, as if checking to make sure they were alone. "There are people, groups, who want to exploit your family's legacy. They've been searching for you, and we've been trying to protect you. That's why we've been tracking you, keeping you off their radar. But something's changed. They know about you now, and they're coming." James felt a knot form in his stomach. "Who's coming?" The man's expression darkened. "We don't know exactly who they are, but they're powerful and they're dangerous. They've been pulling strings in the shadows for decades, and now they're after you." The room seemed to close in around James as the weight of the situation pressed down on him. His life had just taken a turn he couldn't have anticipated, and the stakes were higher than he could have ever imagined. Before he could respond, the door to the room opened, and another man in a suit stepped in, his face grim. "They'd found him. We have to move now." James stood up, his heart racing. "Found me? What do you mean?" The first man grabbed James by the arm, his voice urgent. "There's no time to explain. We need to get you out of here. Now." James felt the panic rising in his chest as the reality of the situation set in. Whatever was happening, it was far from over, and he had a feeling that the truth, whatever it was, would leave him more speechless than the officers who had arrested him. James barely had time to process what was happening before he was being pulled out of the room, the tension in the air thick and unrelenting. The two men in suits moved swiftly, their urgency contagious. James' mind raced, filled with a flood of questions that he couldn't seem to get out fast enough. What exactly had his family been involved in? Who were these people hunting him? And why now, after all these years of living a quiet life, was his world suddenly being turned upside down? They moved through the sterile hallways, past security guards who looked as tense as the men guiding him. The hum of fluorescent lights overhead felt oppressive, and the cold, lifeless walls seemed to close in around him. James wanted to stop, to demand answers, but the fear in the agent's eyes kept him moving. Whatever was coming, it was close, and these men weren't going to risk being caught in its path. As they reached an underground parking garage, the sound of tires screeching in the distance echoed against the concrete. A black SUV sat idling nearby, its engine humming low, waiting for them. James glanced at the agents, his heart pounding. "Where are we going?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "We need to get you somewhere safe," the first man replied, his hand gripping James' shoulder tightly. "You're not safe here anymore, not after they found out." James climbed into the back of the SUV, the door slamming shut behind him. The men got in quickly, the vehicle speeding off almost immediately. As they drove, James' thoughts spun out of control. He had lived his entire life thinking he was just another guy, and now, in the span of a few hours, he was learning that his family had been part of some secret operation, that people were hunting him down, and that his very existence was somehow tied to a dangerous legacy he knew nothing about. But the more he thought about it, the more it started to make a strange kind of sense. There had always been gaps in the story of his family's past, vague answers whenever he asked about his great-grandfather. His mother had never been very forthcoming about their history, brushing it off with cryptic remarks about things being too complicated. He had chalked it up to family secrets, nothing out of the ordinary. But now, as he stared out the window of the speeding car, he realized just how deep those secrets went. "Who are they?" James asked, breaking the silence. "The ones coming after me?" The second agent, who had been quiet until now, glanced at James through the rearview mirror. "We don't know exactly," he said, his voice low and cautious. "They're a shadow group. They operate in the dark, pulling strings behind the scenes. They've been around for decades, maybe longer. But one thing's for sure, if they've targeted you, it's because they believe you're the key to something they want." James frowned, his pulse quickening. "The key to what?" The agent hesitated before answering. "Your great-grandfather was involved in a project that was so secret, not even most of the government knew about it. We don't have all the details, but it had to do with advanced technology. Something way beyond what anyone had ever seen. It was meant to be kept under wraps, but there were leaks. People outside the government who wanted that technology for themselves. They've been searching for it ever since." James felt a chill run down his spine. "And they think I have something to do with it." The agent nodded. "Your great-grandfather disappeared under mysterious circumstances before he could finish the project. But there are rumors that he left behind something. A blueprint, a code, something hidden. And they think you might know where it is." James stared out the window, trying to make sense of it all. He didn't know anything about advanced technology, and he certainly didn't have any hidden blueprints or codes. His life was as ordinary as they came, or so he thought. But if these people believed he had something, they wouldn't stop until they got it. As the car continued speeding through the city, James' mind drifted to his family. His mother, was she safe? Did she know about any of this? The thought of her being in danger because of him made his stomach twist. He needed to know more, but every question seemed to lead to more confusion, more uncertainty. "Do they know where my family is?" James asked, his voice tight with concern. "We've taken steps to protect them," the first agent assured him, though the tension in his voice was still apparent. "For now, they're safe, but we need to focus on keeping you hidden. If they get to you, it's all over." James clenched his fists, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He felt powerless, caught in the middle of a battle he didn't even understand. But one thing was becoming clear. If he didn't start figuring things out, fast, everything he cared about could be destroyed. The SUV pulled off the highway, heading down a narrow, dimly lit road. They were moving away from the city into more remote areas where the buildings thinned out, replaced by long stretches of trees and empty fields. The sense of isolation only added to the growing tension. "We're almost there," the second agent said, glancing back at James. "We've arranged a safe house for you, somewhere off the grid." James nodded, though a part of him felt uneasy. Being hidden away didn't seem like a real solution. He still didn't know who these people were or what they truly wanted. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized how little control he had over any of this. As the car finally came to a stop in front of a small, nondescript cabin nestled in the woods, James stepped out, taking in the eerie quiet of the night. The agents motioned for him to follow them inside, and as they entered, the air felt heavy with tension. The cabin was simple, just a few rooms, enough to stay hidden but not much else. "We'll be here with you," the first agent said, closing the door behind them, "but you need to stay low, no contact with anyone. They'll be watching, and they'll stop at nothing to find you." James looked around the cabin, his mind swirling with questions. How long would he be here? What was the next move? And most importantly, How far were these people willing to go to get what they wanted? The silence in the cabin was deafening, and as James sat down on the edge of the bed in one of the small rooms, he realized just how alone he felt. The weight of the unknown pressed down on him, and for the first time, he started to wonder if he would ever get his life back. The cabin felt more like a prison than a refuge as days dragged on. James found himself trapped in a cycle of anxious thoughts, waiting for something to happen while trying to make sense of the whirlwind that had turned his life upside down. He felt the weight of his great-grandfather's secrets pressing down on him, suffocating in the isolation of the woods. Each creak of the floorboards or rustle of the trees outside sent his heart racing. The agents had been diligent, setting up cameras and surveillance to monitor the area, but James couldn't shake the feeling that they were always just a step behind. Every night, he lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, wondering about the family he left behind. Were they safe? Had they learned anything about the shadow group hunting him down? He imagined the panic on his mother's face if she knew the truth, if she knew he was in danger because of his family's past. That thought alone filled him with a sense of dread. James had spent his life trying to protect them, and now he felt like the cause of their potential doom. His only connection to the outside world was through the agents, who filtered information to him in tight-lipped discussions. They had learned about the Shadow Group's interest in him, but the details were always vague, wrapped in layers of uncertainty. "We're working on finding a lead," they would say, but the days turned into weeks, and he began to wonder if they were ever going to catch a break. The tension in the air was palpable, heavy with the threat of danger lurking just beyond the walls of the cabin. One evening, as James sat at the small kitchen table, the dim light casting shadows across his face, the agents burst in, faces tight with urgency. "We've got a situation," the first agent said, his voice tense. "They're getting closer. We've spotted some vehicles down the road, and we believe they're looking for you." Panic surged through James. "What do we do?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. His heart raced at the thought of those shadowy figures being so close, ready to shatter the fragile peace of their hideout. "We need to relocate you. There's a safe house a few miles from here," the second agent replied, glancing out the window, scanning the tree line as if he expected to see the enemy coming through the brush at any moment. "Grab your things. We'll have to move quickly." James's mind raced as he hurriedly collected what little he had brought with him: a few clothes, his phone, and the old family photo that had somehow found its way into his bag. The weight of the picture felt heavy in his hand, a reminder of the life he once had. He glanced at the agents, who were already gathering their equipment, their faces grim. This was no ordinary threat. They were up against something far more sinister. As they packed up, James couldn't help but feel a mix of fear and determination. He had to learn the truth about his family's past and find a way to put an end to the chaos surrounding him. The urge to run was powerful, but he knew he couldn't just flee without understanding what he was facing. They stepped outside, the cool night air biting at his skin. The tension was electric, crackling with the potential for danger. As they moved quickly toward the SUV, James caught a glimpse of headlights cutting through the trees. His heart dropped, dread pooling in his stomach. "Go! Get in!" the first agent shouted, urgency punctuating his words. James jumped into the back seat as the agents piled in and slammed the doors shut. The SUV roared to life, tires screeching as they sped away, the headlights fading into the darkness. James looked back through the rear window, his mind racing with thoughts of what lay behind him. The Shadow Group was out there, hunting him down like prey, and it felt like they were closing in fast. "Where are we going?" James asked, gripping the edge of the seat as the agents maneuvered through the winding roads. "To a contact who can help us," the second agent replied, his eyes locked on the road ahead. "But we'll need to be careful. If they're tracking you, they'll know where we're headed." James nodded, feeling a mix of hope and dread. The thought of finally getting answers pushed him forward, but the fear of what awaited them at the contact's location was almost unbearable. He could feel the tension in the air, thick and oppressive, as they drove deeper into the night. Minutes felt like hours, and every turn seemed to stretch the silence into something unbearable. Just when he thought they might make it, the agent suddenly slammed on the brakes, sending James lunging forward against his seatbelt. "Get down!" the first agent shouted, ducking low as he reached for his weapon. James barely had time to react before a series of gunshots rang out, the sound echoing through the trees. Bullets struck the back of the SUV, shattering the glass, and James felt his heart pound in his chest, a frantic rhythm that threatened to drown out everything else. Stay down, the second agent yelled, returning fire. The night exploded into chaos as they ducked behind the dashboard, the SUV under attack. James felt fear wrap around him like a vice, squeezing the breath from his lungs. The reality of the situation hit him hard. They had been found, and now there was nowhere to hide. Adrenaline surged through him as he processed the scene. He could hear the shouting of their attackers, menacing voices mixed with the sharp sound of gunfire. James realized that this was the moment, the confrontation he had dreaded but knew would eventually come. "James, listen," the first agent shouted, his voice barely audible over the chaos. "We need to get out of here. On the count of 3, you follow me, and we run for the trees. You understand?" James nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know what else to do. This was the only way. 1, 2, 3. The agents burst out of the SUV, and James followed, adrenaline fueling his legs as he sprinted toward the thick trees. The world around him blurred, the sounds of gunfire and shouting fading into the background. All he could think about was getting to safety, about finding the answers he desperately sought. As they darted into the forest, the night closed in around them, shadows twisting and turning in the dark. James could hear his own breathing, heavy and frantic, and the rustling of leaves underfoot as they moved deeper into the trees. But just as they thought they had gained some ground, James felt a sharp pain in his leg. He stumbled, falling to the ground as the world tilted around him. "James!" He heard one of the agents shout, but the panic rose in his throat, choking him. He tried to get back up, but pain shot through him like fire. His vision blurred, and all he could focus on was the sound of footsteps approaching through the underbrush. The agents were shouting, trying to get to him, but James knew he was in trouble. He could feel the cold grip of fear tightening around him as the shadows of their pursuers loomed closer, the chaos of the outside world closing in fast. The cliffhanger of his reality hung in the balance, and he could only hope that somehow, some way, he would find a way to escape this nightmare. The world around James blurred into a haze of shadows and noise, his heart pounding in his ears as he struggled to catch his breath. The pain in his leg felt like a fire, sharp and consuming, as he fought to regain his composure. But just as he began to push himself off the ground, the shadows converged, and he heard a voice that sent chills racing down his spine. "Don't bother getting up, James. We can't escape this." James froze, his heart racing as he turned to see a figure stepping out from behind a tree, a familiar face that he had never expected to see. It was Marcus, an old friend from high school, the one who had disappeared years ago under mysterious circumstances. Marcus stood tall and confident, a smirk dancing on his lips, but there was something unsettling about the gleam in his eyes. "What are you doing here?" James managed to croak, disbelief washing over him. The tension thickened as the realization dawned on him. Marcus had been gone for so long, and now he stood before him, looking like he had walked straight out of a nightmare. "I've been keeping an eye on you, James. The family name carries a lot of weight, you know," Marcus replied, his tone mocking. "It seems your little secret is about to be exposed, and I'm here to make sure it goes just the way we want it." Before James could respond, he heard the sound of footsteps approaching from behind. The agents had not yet reached him, and now they were racing toward the confrontation, guns drawn. James could see the concern etched on their faces. There was something else, a flicker of recognition in their eyes as they spotted Marcus. "Marcus? You're working with them?" one of the agents shouted, shock and anger lacing his words. The revelation hit James like a punch to the gut. How could his childhood friend be involved with the very group that was hunting him down? "You always were too trusting, weren't you?" Marcus sneered, the playful tone now replaced with a sinister edge. "You think those agents have your best interests at heart? They've been using you, James, just like everyone else. You're a pawn in a game you can't even begin to comprehend." James's mind raced as he processed the betrayal. How had Marcus gotten mixed up in this? Was it all a setup? The stakes had just escalated to a terrifying new level. Not only was he now faced with the threat of the Shadow Group, but he had to deal with a friend turned enemy. Fear mixed with anger surged through him, but there was also a flicker of determination. "No, you're wrong," James said, his voice gaining strength. "I won't let you manipulate me. I need to know the truth. Why are you doing this?" Marcus chuckled, a low, menacing sound that made the hairs on the back of James's neck stand up. "The truth? Oh, you're about to learn a lot, my old friend. You're in way over your head, and this is just the beginning. Suddenly, the agents burst into view, weapons raised, shouting commands as they confronted Marcus. The tension in the air crackled, a mix of adrenaline and fear hanging heavy as the scene unfolded. James struggled to stand, leaning against a tree for support, desperate to keep his wits about him. "Stand down, Marcus. You don't know what you're getting into," one agent yelled, but Marcus merely laughed. "I know exactly what I'm doing. This is a family affair now, and you're not welcome. But don't worry, I'll make sure to let James in on all the fun." With a swift motion, Marcus pulled out a small device from his pocket and pressed a button. James's heart sank as he realized what it was, a tracking beacon. The unmistakable sound of engines roaring in the distance filled the air, and a moment later, headlights illuminated the trees around them. "What did you do?" James shouted, panic rising in his throat. "You've put us all in danger." "Not just you, James. This will bring everyone out into the open, the agents, the Shadow Group, and even your precious family. They'll be here soon, and you'll finally understand just how deep this rabbit hole goes." James's pulse raced as he processed Marcus's words. The looming threat was no longer a distant fear. It was right in front of him. The agents began to shout commands, trying to regain control of the situation, but chaos erupted as the sound of approaching vehicles filled the night. Without warning, figures emerged from the woods. Members of the Shadow Group, their faces obscured by masks, weapons drawn, surrounding them in an instant. The agents were outnumbered, and the sense of hopelessness crept into James's heart. He felt trapped, his past colliding with his present in a way he never imagined possible. The tension was suffocating as both groups faced off, and James stood in the middle, caught between his childhood friend and the unknown danger that now closed in around him. Just as he thought he might scream in frustration, he spotted movement in the distance. More figures stepping out from the trees, their silhouettes illuminated by the headlights. "James," one of the agents shouted, their voice strained. "We need to get out of here. Now." But as they turned to flee, James felt a hand grip his arm, yanking him back. It was Marcus, his expression a mix of anger and triumph. "You're not going anywhere, James. This is where you belong, caught in the web of your family's legacy. I'm here to make sure you don't escape it." James's heart raced as he looked around, panic threatening to overwhelm him. The chaos around him felt like a whirlwind, with danger closing in on all sides. The agents were struggling against the Shadow Group, shots fired, and the air was thick with tension and confusion. You couldn't let Marcus drag him into this darkness. In a moment of clarity, fueled by adrenaline, James wrenched his arm free and took off into the trees, determined to escape the nightmare unfolding behind him. He ran, fueled by fear and desperation, pushing himself harder as the sounds of chaos faded into the background. He didn't know where he was headed, but he had to find a way out, away from Marcus and the web of lies that threatened to ensnare him. His mind raced with questions, uncertainty filling his thoughts. What had Marcus meant by family legacy? Why was he being hunted? As James sprinted deeper into the forest, he felt the weight of his past pressing down on him, but he was determined to uncover the truth. He would find a way to unravel the secrets, and he wouldn't let anyone, especially not Marcus, control his fate. But the danger was far from over. As he navigated through the trees, he could hear footsteps behind him, echoing in the night. The chase had only just begun, and James was about to discover just how deep the darkness ran, and how far he would have to go to reclaim his life and unravel the mystery of his family's past. James's heart raced as he sprinted deeper into the woods, the sounds of chaos fading behind him. He could feel the adrenaline pumping through his veins, urging him to run faster, to escape the clutches of Marcus and the Shadow Group. Every rustle of leaves and snap of branches sent shivers down his spine. He didn't know how far he had gone or where he was heading, but he was determined to find safety. After what felt like an eternity, he stumbled upon a small clearing bathed in moonlight. It was quiet, the oppressive weight of the night momentarily lifting. James leaned against a tree, catching his breath, and tried to calm his racing thoughts. He needed a plan. The Shadow Group was out there, and Marcus was not someone to underestimate. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed from behind him. Panic surged within him, but he forced himself to stay still, pressing against the rough bark of the tree. Two shadowy figures emerged into the clearing, scanning the area with flashlights. James's pulse quickened as he crouched low, trying to blend into the shadows. "Did you see where you went?" one of the figures asked, his voice low and tense. "Not a clue. He couldn't have gone far." "Search the perimeter," the other replied, their tone commanding. James's heart sank. He had to think quickly. He glanced around and spotted a thick patch of bushes nearby. With no other options, he made a run for it, slipping into the foliage just as the figures moved closer. The branches scratched at his skin, but he pushed through, desperately trying to stifle his breathing. The searchlights moved past him, and he could hear the agents calling for backup, their voices growing fainter as they moved deeper into the forest. The danger seemed to have shifted away from him for the moment, but the realization of how close he had come to being caught sent chills down his spine. As he crouched there, James thought of Marcus and the words that had haunted him. The mention of a family legacy weighed heavily on his mind. What did that mean? He felt a sense of urgency swell within him. If there were answers, he had to find them. He couldn't allow Marcus or anyone else to dictate his life any longer. After a few moments, James cautiously peeked through the bushes. The clearing was empty, and the night was quiet once again. Gathering his courage, he crept out of his hiding spot and moved back toward where he had last seen Marcus and the agents. He needed to confront Marcus, to understand why he had betrayed him and what was truly at stake. As he approached the last spot he remembered, he heard voices, loud and heated. He carefully made his way closer, peering around a tree to catch a glimpse of the scene unfolding before him. There they were, Marcus, flanked by two shadowy figures, arguing with the agents. The tension in the air was palpable, crackling like electricity. "It's too late for that. We can't let him get away," Marcus shouted, his expression twisted with anger. "You don't understand what you're dealing with. He is the key." James's heart raced at the mention of his name. The key? What did Marcus mean? He edged closer, desperate to hear more, to piece together the puzzle that had haunted him for so long. Key to what? One of the agents pressed, frustration clear in his voice. "You're risking everything for a dead end." James leaned in closer, every word hanging in the air like a fragile promise. He doesn't even know what he is, his family. They have ties to this organization that run deeper than anyone realizes. If we let him go, it'll all fall apart. A chill ran down James's spine as he processed Marcus's words. His family? What had they been involved in? Just then, he heard a sound behind him. He turned, ready to flee again, but it was too late. "James!" a voice called out, echoing through the trees. He turned to see one of the agents running toward him, relief washing over their face. "We found you." In an instant, Marcus and the Shadow Group shifted their focus, guns raised as they aimed at the newcomer. "Get down!" James shouted, adrenaline surging once more. He knew he had to protect the agent and himself. Cows erupted as the agents exchanged fire with the Shadow Group, bullets whizzing through the air, splintering the trees around them. James felt the adrenaline spike as he ducked, trying to find cover while keeping an eye on Marcus. The confrontation escalated, a mix of shouts and gunfire creating a cacophony of chaos. As the dust began to settle, James spotted Marcus slipping away from the melee, making a break for it. Without thinking, James sprinted after him, fueled by a newfound determination. He couldn't let Marcus escape again. He chased Marcus through the forest, branches snapping underfoot, the sounds of the battle fading into the background. The tension between them was electric, each of them aware that this moment would define everything that had happened up to this point. "Stop!" James shouted, desperation tinging his voice. "You need to tell me the truth." Marcus paused, turning to face him, and for a moment, the intensity of their gaze locked them in place. "You have no idea what you're getting into, James," he said, his voice low. "This isn't just about you. This is about everything, your family, your legacy. You're not just any ordinary person." James felt a surge of anger and confusion. "What do you mean? Just tell me." But before Marcus could respond, a loud explosion echoed through the trees, shaking the ground beneath their feet. The clearing erupted in chaos as debris rained down around them. James and Marcus were thrown to the ground, their faces smudged with dirt and fear. In the aftermath of the explosion, James struggled to his feet, looking around in disbelief. The agents and Shadow Group members were scattered, some injured, while others struggled to regain control. But amidst the chaos, James felt a different kind of shift within himself. He realized he had the power to change his fate, to redefine what legacy meant to him. As he glanced at Marcus, he saw a flicker of fear in his eyes. For the first time, James felt a sense of empowerment. "I don't need your approval, Marcus. I will find my own path, no matter the cost." With that, James turned and ran toward the chaos, ready to confront the truth. He charged into the fray, ready to fight for himself and uncover the mysteries surrounding his family's legacy. The battle was intense, but this time he felt a sense of clarity, a purpose guiding him through the darkness. Then, just as he thought he might reach the heart of the conflict, he felt a sharp pain in his side, followed by a rush of warmth. He stumbled, confusion clouding his thoughts as he looked down, shocked to see blood seeping through his shirt. In that moment, everything seemed to freeze. The realization struck him like lightning. This was the cost of uncovering the truth. But before he could process what was happening, he turned to see Marcus standing behind him, a look of shock and horror etched across his face. "James, I didn't mean to," Marcus began, but the sound of sirens interrupted him, growing louder as they approached. In that instant, James felt the weight of betrayal crash down around him. As the scene erupted into chaos again, James's vision blurred. The sirens rang in his ears, and he felt himself being pulled back from the edge. Darkness crept in, and he struggled to stay awake, desperate to cling to the fragments of his resolve. Just as he was about to lose consciousness, he heard a familiar voice, one of the agents calling his name, urgency lacing every syllable. "Hold on, James. Help is on the way." With that final plea echoing in his mind, James felt himself slipping away. But before everything faded to black, he caught a glimpse of Marcus, his expression shifting from triumph to despair as he realized the gravity of his actions. And in that moment of uncertainty, James understood that this was only the beginning. The fight was far from over, and the truth would come to light in ways he never anticipated. James awoke to the sound of muffled voices and the soft beeping of machines. His eyes fluttered open, squinting against the bright overhead lights. It took a moment for him to remember where he was, but as the memories of the previous night flooded back, Marcus, the explosion, the betrayal, he felt a wave of anxiety wash over him. He tried to sit up, but a sharp pain shot through his side, forcing him to gasp and lie back down. The sterile smell of antiseptic filled the room, and he realized he was in a hospital bed, bandages wrapped around his torso. Panic surged through him as he tried to piece together what had happened. Had he lost everything? Had Marcus gotten away? Suddenly, the door creaked open, and a nurse stepped in, her expression a mix of concern and relief. "You're awake. Thank goodness. We were worried about you." She checked the machines and adjusted the IV connected to his arm. "You've had quite an ordeal. But you're safe now." James nodded weakly, still trying to grasp the reality of his situation. "What happened? Where's Marcus?" The nurse hesitated, looking down at her clipboard. "You were brought in after the explosion. The police are investigating the incident. There were several people involved, both agents and members of the Shadow Group. I can't say much, but I know that the situation is being handled." James's heart sank. He felt a mixture of relief and frustration. The chaos had brought him here, but what about the answers he desperately needed? "What about my family?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Did they know?" The nurse looked at him sympathetically. "They've been informed about your condition. They'll be here soon. Just focus on recovering right now." As she left the room, James lay back against the pillows, staring at the ceiling. He needed to get out of here. He had to confront Marcus and understand what had happened. His thoughts raced as he considered the implications of the last night. If Marcus was part of something bigger, something involving his family, he needed to know the truth. After what felt like an eternity, the door opened again, and this time it was his parents. Their faces were a mix of relief and worry as they rushed to his side. His mother reached for him, tears glistening in her eyes. "Oh, James, we were so scared." "Mom, I'm fine. Just a little banged up," he reassured her, trying to maintain a brave face. His father stood beside her, a stoic expression masking his concern. "What happened out there?" his father asked, his voice steady but laced with urgency. "The news said it was a violent confrontation. They're calling it the terrorist attack." James felt the weight of his father's words, realizing that the implications were far-reaching. "It was more than that. I didn't know it at the time, but Marcus, He was involved with something dangerous, something tied to our family. I need to find him." His parents exchanged worried glances, and his mother spoke up gently. "Honey, we're just glad you're safe. This can wait until you're stronger." "No," James insisted, frustration bubbling up. "I can't wait. If there are answers out there, I have to find them. I can't let this go." With a determined look, he swung his legs over the side of the bed, feeling the cool floor beneath his feet. He ignored the pain in his side and steadied himself. "I need to go. I need to confront Marcus." His parents tried to dissuade him, but James's resolve was unyielding. He would not be a victim of this chaos. He would take control of his life. He stumbled to the door, and with a final glance at his worried parents, he stepped into the hallway. The hospital was bustling with activity, but James's focus was singular. He needed to find answers, and he knew that Marcus was his only lead. As he walked through the corridors, he could overhear snippets of conversations, discussions about the explosion, the shadow group, and the casualties. The weight of it all pressed down on him, but he pushed through, determined to reach the truth. Finally, he made his way to the hospital's main entrance, where the chaos of the outside world greeted him. News crews were gathered, reporting on the aftermath of the explosion. James squinted against the bright lights, feeling an uneasy mix of fear and determination. He took out his phone, dialing Marcus's number. The phone rang several times, and just as he was about to hang up in frustration, he heard a voice on the other end. "James?" It was Marcus, his tone hesitant and cautious. "I'm alive," James said, cutting straight to the point. "I need to see you." "Are you okay?" Marcus asked, genuine concern lacing his voice. "There's a lot you don't understand." "Then explain it to me. What's going on? Why did you betray me?" James felt the anger surge within him, but underneath that anger was a flicker of something else, a connection they shared that he still couldn't ignore. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I was trying to protect you," Marcus replied, desperation creeping into his voice. "Meet me at the old park. I'll explain everything." James agreed, his heart racing as he ended the call. The park was only a short walk away, but it felt like an eternity as he navigated the streets filled with chaos and confusion. The night had changed everything. When he reached the park, the moon hung high in the sky, casting a silvery light over the desolate playground. He spotted Marcus sitting on a bench, looking more vulnerable than he had ever seen him. "What's going on?" James demanded, his voice sharp. Marcus sighed, running a hand through his hair. "There are things about your family's history that you don't know. Your parents were involved in something bigger than just ordinary life. They were connected to a network that fights against groups like the one that attacked us." James felt his heart drop. "What do you mean?" "They've been protecting you from this world, from the danger that comes with our legacy," Marcus explained. "I thought I could keep you safe, but it spiraled out of control." James processed the information, anger mixed with confusion. "So you lied to me? You used me?" "No, I wanted to tell you everything, but I was afraid of how you'd react," Marcus said, his voice filled with regret. "I never wanted you to get hurt, James, but now it's too late. They'll come after you." The weight of his words hung in the air, and for a moment, silence enveloped them. James's mind raced. The world was far more complicated than he had ever imagined. What do I do now? Marcus looked at him, determination filling his eyes. "We fight. Together. I know it's a lot to ask, but we can't let them control our lives. You deserve to know the truth and reclaim your legacy." As the weight of the moment sank in, James felt a surge of clarity. He realized that this was not just about him or Marcus. It was about taking a stand against those who sought to manipulate and destroy. He had the chance to reclaim his identity, to write his own story. With a newfound sense of purpose, James nodded. "Okay, let's do this." The night stretched on as they began to discuss their plans, weaving together their strengths and resources. It was just the beginning of a long journey filled with uncertainty and danger, but they would face it together. As they walked away from the park, a sense of hope blossomed within James. The road ahead would be fraught with challenges, but he understood now that he had the power to change his fate. He wouldn't be just a pawn in someone else's game. He would carve out his own path and uncover the truth about his family, no matter the cost. In the days that followed, James found himself immersed in a world of secrets and alliances. He and Marcus worked tirelessly, reaching out to others who shared their vision of exposing the shadow group and revealing the truth to the public. They built a network, each connection a thread woven into their growing tapestry of resistance. The journey was not without its struggles. They faced setbacks, betrayals, and moments of doubt. But through it all, James found strength in his newfound purpose. The people around him began to see him not just as the victim of an attack, but as a leader who was willing to fight for change. As they prepared for their next move, James stood on the brink of a new chapter. He had transformed from a young man seeking answers into a symbol of resilience and hope. The challenges ahead loomed large, but he no longer felt fear. He felt empowered. In the end, this journey had taught him the importance of connection, the value of truth, and the strength found in unity. James looked ahead with determination, ready to face whatever lay in the shadows. He knew now that he would not only fight for himself, but for those who could not fight for themselves, ensuring that their voices would be heard. As the sun rose on the horizon, illuminating the path ahead, James took a deep breath, ready to embrace the challenges and victories that awaited him. He was no longer just James. He was a force for change, and he was prepared to take on the world.